Greetings YouTube, my name is Alex and I am the Reef Dork, and today I'm going to give you a detailed overview of the Red Sea Reefer Sump. Now I of course have the Peninsula 500, but this has the Red Sea 2018 V3 sump, and that is the sump that they are putting in all of their current tank range with the possible exception of the 170 and the nano. So if you buy a Red Sea tank today, it will have this sump. Let's take a closer look. So before we go into the sump itself, I'm going to show you the plumbing, and that starts with a weir box. So in the weir box you have the return pipe that takes water from the sump into the tank. That's not the standard nozzle, by the way. The drain, that's the main drain that takes water from the tank to the sump, and then the emergency drain. Now this, you can see this clear plastic section here, that's about 2 inches tall, and the water enters at the bottom of that and usually only drains from there, although at the moment it is slightly draining from the emergency drain as well. Now I have found a couple of times that the water level has changed in here. So first time a couple of months ago, the water level slightly rose, which meant that the water was pouring into the emergency drain. And I think that was probably because a snail got stuck in the main drain or something along those lines. And then a couple of months later, the water level dropped, which meant actually the water was as low as the bottom part of the main drain. And I suspect that's because the snail got unstuck. And when that happens, when the water level changes, the tank starts to gurgle, and it sounds a little something like this. But that's actually an easy fix, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. But for now, I'll just show you what happens when you turn the return pump off. So there you go, the water level drops to the bottom of the main drain where the water enters and sits there in the weir box. All that drains into the sump, and the display tank stays just below the height of the weir comb, and that's only lower because some of the water has gone down the main return. So that means that when the return pump is off, water level in the main tank will look something like that. And if and when you do get water level changes and you need to stop the gurgling, all you need to do is turn the diaphragm in the middle of the screen. So this is onto the main drain, you turn it that way to open it, and then you turn it that way to shut it, and that's how Red Sea get these tanks running silently. As you can hear, there's no noise whatsoever going on in there. There's a tiny trickling sound, but that's about it. Otherwise, the plumbing is completely silent. Now I should point out at this stage that not all of this pipe work is standard. The one at the back, this pipe here, is a manifold that I've installed myself, and so that doesn't come as standard, but we have here the return pipe which takes water from the sump to the tank. Then that's the main drain, and that is the emergency drain. So now let's take a look at how water flows around the sump. This is the same in all current Red Sea tanks. The layout of the pipework might be slightly different, but the flow and setup of the sump is always the same. So the water comes in from the back there, goes through the filter sock section, then goes through into the next section. The next section is the Refugium section, and that is usually separated by a baffle, which I have taken out, and I'll show you that here. Now, as you can see, there is a nice little algae comb that should stop strands of algae escaping and going into the next section. The next section is the Skimmer Chamber, which is here. I've chosen to put an algae reactor there, and the water will flow then from the Skimmer Chamber back into the return section and then back up into the main tank. So that's roughly how the water flow worked. Now let's take a closer look at each section. Here then we have the filter socks. Now a lot of people will tell you these are a pain in the backside, and I completely agree. You have to change them quite regularly, and to do so is quite difficult. I find that you can't take that out, can't pull the tray out unless you've taken the filter socks out first, and for me that defeats the entire point. And I would far rather have that as an empty section to put a filter roller in. Now you can put one in yourself, but as you can see here, there is a glass section that you will have to remove first, and doing that is going to be quite difficult. If you're going to put a filter roller in first, make sure you do it before you set the tank up. But to its credit, you can see the filter socks do a job, and actually if you don't like that, you can get media cups that will hold things like activated carbon or maybe filter floss. Then the water goes through to the next section. Now normally that is completely separated by the baffle I showed you earlier, and actually you can change the size of that section by moving the baffle. As you can see there, it can either slot in at the front or at the back, so you can have a small or a large Refugium depending on how big your skimmer is. And actually one nice touch of the baffle that goes in there is that you can see along the bottom there is a layer of silicone, Now that does two things. Firstly, it creates a nice seal so water doesn't go underneath the baffle, but also if you're lifting the baffle out and drop it, it's not going to shatter your entire sump. It'll give some kind of shock absorption. And one of the things I love about this sump is that it is quite versatile, because you can remove that baffle, so it'll give you a small refugium section or a large refugium section. It means that you can play around with what you've got. Now I've got a huge skimmer that doesn't quite fit in the skimmer section when the baffle's in, and I've got an algae reactor that I want to put in there as well, so I can just take the baffle out and fill that with what I want. I've also got plenty of space for something like a phosphate reactor if I need to add one later, or you could put bio pellets or Cyperax or all sorts of other things in there. So it's a really versatile setup, as opposed to the usual setups where they have a baffle down there, a baffle down there, and a baffle down there, all with fixed sections, so you have to buy equipment very carefully. With this, you can afford to put much bigger equipment in there and move things around as you want. The next section then is the skimmer chamber. Now I have an algae reactor in there, as I said, and this is an adjustable size depending on how big you want your refugium. But this is a constant height chamber, and that height is regulated by a baffle along here. Now again, that baffle is adjustable, so it can go as high as the top of that or as low as where the water level is there. So you can adjust the water level depending on what your skimmer likes. Now actually my skimmer is a NIOS Quantum 220 and would prefer a lower water level, but I can always raise it up. So it's a really useful feature to be able to adjust very easily the height of the skimmer section. And then we come into the final section, which is the return section. Now in here, you've got plenty of space for a return pump. That is a Vectra L1, which is absolutely huge and actually too big for this tank. So you certainly won't need anything bigger than that, and you will have plenty of space in there. So much so that I've managed to put some Cyperax in there, for example. Now, one thing you may realise is that there is a float valve at the back of that section. And if you're thinking that looks slightly odd, you are right, it should not be there like that. But the reason you can see it is because I have taken out the freshwater reservoir. And the reason I've done that is because I hate the standard setup with the freshwater top-up section. This is the only section really that I didn't particularly like, and it was quite easy to change myself. And I'll show you why I don't like it. So, that is the freshwater top-up reservoir. Now, that is a fairly big unit, nearly dropped it. That's a fairly big unit, which is great because realistically, you should be able to last yourself almost a week without replacing it, without topping it up, but it gets in the way. So it gets in the way of changing the filter socks, and it gets in the way of accessing the plumbing and all that sort of stuff. And I also found it to be quite unreliable. There were a couple of times when it drained the entire lot into the tank, and there were a couple of times when it clogged up for no apparent reason, and I only really had it in there for a couple of months. So I decided to get rid of that completely, free up space, and use a traditional reservoir with a remote pump. And that for me frees up loads of space and actually makes the sump a lot more usable. So for the sake of completeness, here is a quick shot of the freshwater reservoir in place. Now it is quite big and clunky, and as you can see, it does make getting your arms in the sump cabinet a little bit awkward. It might just be me being stupid with the filter sock trays, removing them, but you can't remove them that way as well. And I also found topping it up with the standard 25 litre barrels and even the smaller 10 litre barrels was extremely awkward, so you had to do it a different way and use much smaller canisters, otherwise they wouldn't fit between the top of the cabinet and the top of the freshwater reservoir. So that completes the tour of the sump, but there's one last thing to show you, and that is the cabinet. Now the cabinet is actually a reasonable size. The massive plug board I've got in there is about 6 inches front to back, so it takes up quite a lot of space, and you can see that I've left space underneath it for a dosing unit, so that shows you roughly how much space there is. But actually it's a really big cabinet, loads of space in there. You could put a freshwater barrel in there so you can use it as a top-up section, but I've just used it for the plugs and a dosing arrangement. I've also put a couple of hooks on the cabinet door so I can hold nets, my pipette and my coral grabbing device. But really there's absolutely loads of space in there, and you shouldn't want any more space from a sump cabinet. One thing to note is the ventilation, or lack of it. That is the very end of the cabinet, and you can see a fairly small space that's less than 1 foot squared. That is pretty much the only gap in the entire cabinet with the exception of a very small one in the sump area itself. And here is the even smaller section in the sump, so any humid air has to go from the sump right up through that tiny little hole and then out the side. So you might find this tank does get a bit humid in the sump area, although I've not noticed it being a problem in the first few months. Now, as I say, I have found this sump to be versatile, and it means that you can really play around with it and tailor it to exactly how you want it. One of the things that I would criticise it for though is putting in a manifold. A manifold is quite difficult to put in this sump. The one I've put in at the back that goes across on the top right hand corner where those taps are, that feeds off from its own pump. Now what I would ideally have is a T-valve that goes off there and then feeds the manifold up there. But that's quite difficult to do because you've got to get round all of the main plumbing and you'd have to go up at an angle or up and then back. So it does make it a little bit more difficult. And if you had the water coming in that end and then going back out that end, it would make putting a manifold in much easier. But that's pretty much the only criticism I've got, and you can still work around it as I have done. So just to round up, here is a quick top-down view so you can see all the sections. Filter socks on the far left, algae section on the far right, skimmer section in the front right corner, then back into the return chamber on the left hand corner. There's also decent space up top to put in place nice strip lighting, although you can probably do a significantly better job than I have done. And that's pretty much all there is to tell you. You'll make up your own mind as to whether or not you like this sump, but for my money, the versatility is excellent. And even though the filter socks are a pain in the backside, I do like that there as a first section. The only thing I would like as an improvement on there is if it was much easier to fit in a filter roller. Maybe that's something for them to work on in version 4. So there you have it then. The plumbing is absolutely silent, and the sump itself is really good because you're not constrained by having fixed size compartments like you are with traditional sumps. And the other thing I didn't mention about the sump is that it has comparatively low sides, and that makes taking things like your skimmer or your algae reactor or your phosphate reactor out much easier. Go and have a look at the EA Reef tanks, see how tall the sumps are, and just imagine trying to take your skimmer out of that. But there are of course negatives. The filter socks are a bit of a pain in the backside. You have to replace them regularly, and it will be difficult to pull them out and replace them with a filter roller. Also, the auto top off is quite big and ungainly, gets in the way, and I found it quite unreliable. And of course the ventilation might be an issue, but only really if you keep plugs in the actual sump section itself, which I would strongly recommend you don't do. And finally, if you want to put a manifold on the return side, then that can be quite difficult. It can still be done, but you'll need to plan it pretty carefully, and you're probably better off just running one off a separate pump. So that's it then. If you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe for future content. And until next time, I've been the Reef Dork. Thank you, good night.